So we've broken our rock down into little tiny, basically a powder. Depending on the quality of your ore, it depends on the size that you're after. We don't need to get into discussing what specifically we're after at that point. So getting the ore out, well, in the old school way, we can use gravity, right? And this only works for some minerals, right? Some minerals are very, very heavy with respect to others. So gold panning is an example of using gravity separation. So we run water over it or we run it through a sluice like this, and all the lighter grain materials slough off and go out into the waste tailings where the really heavy stuff stays behind. Again, gold is pretty famous for that, but that's not viable for other metals. Um, Oftentimes we use things like magnetic separators, particularly if the metal that we're after is magnetic. So you can see here there's magnets that are rotating around. The non-magnetic stuff falls out as waste. The magnetic stuff is rised up. So that's another way to separate. I keep moving my little image around. Hopefully you can see. So it's not covering what we're looking at in the PowerPoint. Then another really important one is froth flotation, excuse me. And so we add coatings, there's like an additive to the powder, and we put it in a kind of a chemical bath. It's mostly water, and we insert bubbles. And minerals will actually develop a froth, like if they're what we call hydrophobic, means they're afraid of water, and the additive allows them to do that. So if it's a hydrophobic mineral, it will concentrate in the froth. And so if you imagine all these little tiny bubbles, eventually it starts to develop this thick foam on the top, like a cappuccino, but it's not a pretty white foam. It's a black, gross, disgusting looking foam filled with, in a way, money, right? Filled with the mineral that you're concerned with. So froth flotation is really, really common. You can see that's what's happening here. And this kind of thick black froth is where those valuable minerals are concentrated. We can kind of skim that off and then further process that. Heap leaching, this is really common. You'll actually learn a little bit more about this later in the material. So we take a heap, which is a pile of this very fine grained material. Run of mine ore just means basically the rocks that we blasted out. We crushed it, made it really small, and then we piled it up. So we just have a big pile of our crushed up material. We put it on a surface that's impermeable, but it has drainage, right? So we can, if it were to rain, the water would go through, it would hit that impermeable layer, then it would drain off into drains that we control. So here, this is really common with gold, and we take cyanide. So cyanide doesn't sound great, but we basically kind of put what you might think of as like a drip system, sprinkler system on top of this, and we run cyanide through this material, and it dissolves the minerals into a fluid. They go into fluid. Gold, again, this is like really, really, really common with gold. So that fluid is now filled with gold. It hits that impermeable layer and it goes off into a drain. And you can see that that's what they're calling a pregnant solution here, meaning it's filled with the metals that you're after. We separate those out, and then we reuse that material. So it kind of sounds scary. This is what's going to be happening up at the Stibnite area. Idaho, I don't think, has issued a permit for a heap leach pad in 25 years. But again, the technology has changed. We can keep this pretty controlled. So again, separation, you can see here's a heap leach project, with the impermeable liners going in. Oftentimes there's layer after layer after layer of liner to protect any loss. First of all, that's loss of money, but also ecological damage. And again, we're keeping track of groundwater. If anything happens, everyone gets sued, right? So at that point, we've now concentrated our metal and we can further smelt it and refine it. I'm not going to go into that too much because at that point, like, you understand that we now have the metal minerals. Here, it's really just being processed, concentrated, and smelted from any impurities that it has to go to market, right? So then it just goes on the commodities market. Um, but the story's not over, even though the metal story is over. But remember, we're talking about the arc of a mine, right? So mine life in general, you have to, in the modern world, restore everything. And so you can see here, this is a mine that was freshly finished. This is a big mine. So all of this material here that you see piled up, these are all mine tailings. This is waste material. Um, this is up at Stibnite, Idaho. This is what was left behind from mining, really over the last 120 years. This is a problem, right? This lake here is acidic, it's toxic, but it was left there legally, really in like the 1980s. The story there is kind of complicated, but any mining that's going to happen there, and it will be happening up there shortly, Idaho, that's our new mining degree, is in part kind of in conjunction with this company. All of this has to be fixed, right? You can't do this anymore. And so not only are you extracting the metals and kind of using the wealth kind of with that to provide jobs and to provide, it's good $100,000 a year jobs for CWI students, good jobs, trust me. A lot of that is environmental work, right? So you just can't do this anymore. Here, this is a mine where they've got the tailings. They've started to contour them. You can see it's starting to look fairly smoothed out. We use what are called geomembranes, where we have layers of these materials, these like cloth, sometimes cloth materials that are covering, then soil, then more, then soil. And so you may have to bring in, some ungodly number of truckloads of soil to reclaim everything. But when it's done, you can see again, that's what they're doing here. They're recontouring and reclaiming. But when it's done, we're looking for something like this that has then been vegetated, right? So we replant everything and we spread grass seed and we spend years kind of keeping track of the restoration of that area. So that's kind of the arc of modern mining. And then the other thing that kind of continues in perpetuity is at this point, we now need to get back to our baseline comparisons, right? If you remember, that was something we established prior to developing the mine. But now we have environmental monitoring and baseline comparison that really exists in perpetuity, right? Because this was your agreement, right? Remember that whole social capital thing where I showed you the pictures of the houses and moving into the area. First thing everyone's going to say is like, well, you better clean up after yourself, right? And that's a legal requirement, right? To make sure that we're not leaving it worse than it was. Okay, so the rest of this, we're going to cover in subsequent videos. But one of the things I wanted to say before we move on is that when we think about mining, it's geologists are pragmatists, right? It is very Pollyannish, or I guess I could say naive, to think that we can get by without mining. I'm just looking at my table. This is a little divot fixer. I like to golf. It's made out of metal, right? This came out of a hole in the ground. Here's my computer mouse. This not only has metal in it, but it has plastics, which are oil, and it has computer chips, which are silicone and all sorts of other things. What else do I have? I've got a phone in my pocket. I don't know, this is my kids. There's fluoride in this toothpaste. That was mine. Um, Outside, there's phosphorus that I've used in my fertilizers. That comes out of a mine, right? Very, very little of that stuff doesn't come out of a mine. So when we think about the role of mining in the modern world, it is not very sensible just to say no. When we do, what happens is our mining gets outsourced. And really, as a nation, that's what we did largely in the kind of late 80s and early 90s. Most of our mineral extraction was outsourced. We decided, no, we don't want the mining here. And as a consequence, that then gets outsourced to countries that have no environmental regulations and they have no worker protections. And so when we think about, well, if we're not mining here, we're mining somewhere else because we're mining regardless, right? That's happening. Um, but the idea is it better to do that in our backyard where we do have, worker protections and environmental regulations, or do we outsource that to a less developed country that has none of that stuff? And the kind of classic example you see is when people start talking about EVs and, you know, invariably someone posts a picture of little children working in a cobalt mine in Africa. Well, Idaho has the cobalt belt, right? We have that resource here if we were to use it. And so when we start thinking about what really is the impact and the role of mining, I'm of the opinion that, well, they're not all good and they're not all bad. And it's worth looking individually at these projects and seeing, like, is this a viable project? Does it pose a significant threat to health and human safety? Then maybe not, right? But if it's something that can be done, provide great jobs, kind of economic stimulus for oftentimes an economically depressed area. Um, it's really not a straightforward story, as a lot of people like to make it. But at this point, I'm gonna go. Well, actually, here I'll do my hold on, trying to drive Zoom here. I'm gonna go back to my full screen. Um, so I know I just added this content, but I think it's really important. It helps us understand what the big picture of mining is. Also, if you haven't gotten a chance to talk to me or you're maybe interested in doing this, that is something that CWI, in conjunction with a lot of companies around the state, and both kind of the state government and the federal government, right? We're getting our fingers into a lot of different things to really help develop the mining workforce. Those jobs range from environmental technicians, mining technicians, all sorts of things like that. And again, they pay really well. So if that's something that you're curious about, shoot me an email. I can kind of talk to you more about that. Or if you find me in the hallway someday, chat me up. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and let you get through the rest of the mining content. I'll check in with you later. Bye.